In November of 1703, Rabbi David Nieto delivered a controversial sermon at the Bevis Marks Synagogue in London, causing a rift in the local Jewish community. The cause of the feud may have been mundane politics, but ultimately it forced a thought-provoking rabbinic responsum from one of the greatest luminaries of the age, discussing nature, God, deism, and pantheism. Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, famously known as the Chacham Tzvi, was a famous Rav in Europe who lived during the 1600s and the early 1700s. And he has a sefer of Shalos HaTshuvos that's called Shalos HaTshuvos Chacham Tzvi. And Siman Yud Ches opens with the following. First, he gives you the year, that is Tov Samach He, which comes out to the year 1705, so we know when this story transpires, in the year 1705. What's the Maisa? So he writes it like this. Shaila min haparnasim va'manhigim. I got a question from the leaders in the community Asher b'kehila k'dosha Londres, which is the city of London. V'zeh toirev she'elasam, and this is their question. What's the question? There's a Chacham Hamarumam V'naila. There's a very special rabbi, and his name is Kvod Marenu Arav David Nieto. And he is the Av Beistin, and he is the Moira Tzedek in this Kehila K'dosha that's called Sharei Shamayim. To this day in London, in the East End, there is a synagogue that's called the Bevis Marks, or Bevis Marks Synagogue. And it, on the top of the building, it says that it was established, I think it says 1701 or 1702, and this is when that shul was built. And it says the word Sharei Shamayim, that's the name of this congregation. A little background. For many years, Jews were not allowed to live in England. They were expelled around the year 1290, and they were not readmitted until the mid-17th century. Who were the first Jews to move to England? It was the Sephardim. It was the Jews who had left Spain and Portugal. Some of them had left as Moranos, and then they re-embraced their Judaism or their descendants, and they were looking for places to live. So one of the famous places they went was to Amsterdam. And that was the primary community of these former Moranos that were living in Amsterdam. Some came to New York. That was the first Kehila that began in New York City, was this same type of Jew. And likewise in London. So they moved to London, and so this Kehila is just getting started. And so they build this shul in 1701 or 1702, and they have this rabbi. Who's the rabbi? The rabbi is Rabbi David Nieto. We'll talk more about him in a second. And they have this shaila, and they're turning with their shaila to the Chacham Tzvi. What happened? That David Nieto was darash bebeis haknesses drushzeh. He gave the following sermon, and toyaroi mutuk meloshen laz l'shonenu hakdosha. And in order for the Chacham Tzvi, who did not read Spanish, to be able to understand what the speech said, it was translated into Hebrew. So in other words, the Rabbi David Nieto gave a speech in the shul in the year 1704, 1705. We'll see the exact dates soon. And this speech was controversial, problematic, so much so that they turned to the Chacham Tzvi for help and for guidance about this issue. So let's, for a minute, talk about a little bit about who this Rabbi David Nieto was. He was born to parents who had come from Spain and Portugal. And he grew up in Italy, and he gets offered the Rabbanus, the position of being the Rav in London of this community in the year 1701. And so he moves there and he becomes the rabbi. Now what happens is, immediately, he realizes there was a big crisis in the community of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. And this led him to author a book that's called Mata Don. What was the problem he observed? The problem he observed was the following. There were people who grow up and they know that they're Jewish, but they didn't have a Jewish education. But they knew, their parents told them that they're a Jew. So they understood that if they're going to re-embrace Judaism, it's going to mean that they're not supposed to work on Saturday, the seventh day, rather than Sunday. They understood that. They understood that they're going to need a bris milah. They understood that. Things in Torah Shabbat, they understood. But then what happened was that when they would come to join a Jewish community and they started learning all of a sudden about Yom Tov Sheni Shal Golias, and they started learning about other dinim derabanan, and they started learning about machloikasin and things like that, this was very foreign to them. When growing up as Christians, just knowing that they were Jews, they had no clue about this whole concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And in fact, if they had any education about it, they probably heard negative things about it. And so what happened was that during the 1600s, there were a few instances of where Jews expressed their dissatisfaction. These Spanish and Portuguese Jews expressed dissatisfaction or disbelief in different inyanim in Torah Sheba'al Peh. So Rabbi David Nieto faced this problem, and so he had to write a sefer, and he wrote a sefer called Matadon Kuzari Sheni. There was a sefer that was written hundreds of years before that was called the Kuzari. Can't get too much into it, but basically Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote a whole sefer that was dealing with hashkafa issues, and he wrote it as a dialogue, and that was called the Kuzari. So Rabbi David Nieto emulated that and wrote a whole nother dialogue, but modern, dealing with modern issues, the questions that he was being confronted with. So you see, if you look at the second text here, you'll see that the Vikuach Rishon, what is he set it up as a dialogue between a king who wants to learn about Judaism, just like the original Kuzari, and a rabbi. So the first Vikuach Rishon, the first discussion, is going to prove that all of the mitzvahs that were commanded to our ancestors, Sai, the mitzvahs Hasei, and the mitzvahs Lois Hasei, these were all existed Baal Peh before they were transcribed into the Torah. Number one. Number two, during the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and during the time of the Nevi'im and Tzaddikim, the Yidden always had Torah Sheba'al Peh. Number three, we need to have Torah Sheba'al Peh even for the mitzvahs that seem obvious to us from the Torah. This is something that we have to have. So you're able to get a taste of the types of things that he's trying to deal with in this sefer. But this sefer he published around the year 715. Let's back up to the year 1704. Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, comes, and Rabbi David Nieto sends an urgent message to his community. And what's the message? The message is that the group that he himself had excommunicated, the group of Jews who he has said cannot step foot into the shul, the group of Jews that he stripped them of their membership because it's Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is a time that everyone needs to come to shul, and we say before Kol Nidre that we give permission to daven im avaryanim, so therefore I'm inviting them that they could come back, and not only they could come back for Yom Kippur, they could stay through Hoshana Rabbah, and then after the excommunication is going to go back on. What is this excommunication? Why were there Jews excommunicated that required this whole workaround for Yom Kippur? So you go back a few months to the month of Adar of the same year, in the year 1704. There's a Jew by the name of Yeshua Tzarfati, who is a card-carrying member of this Shaarei Shamayim synagogue in London. And there's a chasana. And Rabbi David Nieto is at the chasana. Yeshua Tzarfati refuses to enter the house. He says, I am not going into this house where the wedding is being celebrated. Why? Because Rabbi David Nieto is inside, and he's a heretic. So I refuse to be under the same roof with him. Now, had he kept this to himself, probably it wouldn't have been a problem. But he informed another member of the Kehillah. That member of the Kehillah let the community council, the leaders of the community, let them know. And this turned into a big issue. They summoned him, they summoned Yeshua Tzarfati, and they said to him, what is this business that you didn't want to walk into the room with the rabbi? He said, yeah, the rabbi's a heretic, I confirm, I stand by it. Okay, why was he a heretic? So first of all of this information that we have, there's a book that's called History of the Ancient Synagogue of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, put out by Rabbi Moses Gaster in the year 1901, and he had access to all of the documents that have this whole controversy. There's also an article by a man named Israel Solomons from 1931. He also had access to this correspondence, the letters, the back and forth, and so all of this information is coming from there. So why did Yeshua Tzarfati consider the rabbi a heretic and didn't want to be under the same roof? This brings us back to earlier that year. Really, it's the end of 1703. The end of 1703, the 20th of November, which was Chav Gimel Kislev Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev, which is the exact same kriyas as this Shabbos. This coming Shabbos is going to be Chav Gimel Kislev Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev. And what happened was that Rabbi David Nieto gave a speech, and in this speech he said certain words, and we'll see the words that we'll see the content of the speech that was so problematic. And this is why Yeshua Tzarfati said, I can't be under the same roof with him. And he tells the community that he's willing to bet 100 pounds that he's right, and so therefore they need to find a bezdin, a third-party bezdin, and they're going to show who's right. Is Yeshua Tzarfati right, or is Rabbi David Nieto right. Anyway, the community wasn't really interested in this, and so that's why he was banned, which is why he and his friends had to be invited back, because he went out with a few people who agreed with him. They had to be invited back to come back for Yom Kippur. During this whole controversy, one of the members of these dissenters passed away, and his name was Rabbi Yosef Cohen de Azveda. Now, he was a rabbi, so he would have deserved a prominent plot in the cemetery in London. But Poyle, the man named Solomon, who I mentioned earlier, investigated and found that he was buried all the way on the outskirts of the cemetery, which was normal. In those days, someone who passed away when they were excommunicated was not buried in the main part of the cemetery. He passed away during this particular controversy. Okay, so it's matters are getting worse, and in fact, there's some evidence that when people were excommunicated, went to the secular authorities and they said, look what's going on over there. They excommunicated us. They said we can't go into the shul. The rabbis and the community leaders shouldn't have that type of power. And they involved the Attorney General in London on this issue. So obviously things got out of hand. So the first thing is Rabbi David Nieto published a pamphlet defending himself. Okay, so he did that, but that didn't help anything. And so now they're going to talk, the community decides, okay, we're going to actually get outside help. Who's going to help us out? So the flagship institution of Spanish-Portuguese Jewry is in Amsterdam. So they send a message to the Kehillah in Amsterdam that says, we have this issue, can you help resolve? The bottom line is that they did not get an answer. And then that's when the official community wrote. There were a few individuals that wrote a letter, and that we're going to read part of their letter now. They also wrote to Amsterdam, help us out. They also did not get a response. Let's read from a little of the letter that these individuals wrote. They wrote as follows. It must be known to your excellencies that this holy congregation is at present in a turmoil through the doctrine which was preached in our pulpit on the 23rd of Kislev, 5464, which again is the year 1703, corresponding with 20th November 1703. I don't think today you can have 20th November coming out on 23rd of Kislev, but then the calendar, this is before the reform of the calendar, the Gregorian calendar, then it was still the Julian calendar, so things were 10 days, there was a 10-day difference, so I think that would explain this. Anyway, so it's Parsha of Vayeshev Yaakov, and it is as follows. So what did he say? They're writing to Amsterdam. This is what he said. They say that I have said in the yeshiva, meaning with Talmidim, that God and nature and God are the same. This is a speech he's giving in front of the congregation. They say I said that God and nature is one. I did say so. I affirm it, and I will prove it. This is the tamsis of the controversy, is the fact that he linked nature and God, and that he said the two are one and the same. And so they write to Amsterdam, is this kosher? Is this okay what he said? Is it not? They never get their response. What are they going to do now? So they want to turn to another community, again, Spanish-Portuguese community. So there was another one in Hamburg. The problem was that in Hamburg at the time, there was no functioning Bezdin. The previous rabbi had passed away, and so therefore that wasn't an option. So interestingly, they turned to the Chacham Tzvi. Why the Chacham Tzvi? The Chacham Tzvi lived right near Hamburg, in a town called Altena. He was an Ashkenazi. His last name is Ashkenazi, Tzvi Ashkenazi. However, he had a lot of his chinuch was in the Ottoman Empire, in different cities with a strong Sephardi influence, and he learned with a lot of Sephardish Chachamim, which is why he got the name Chacham Tzvi, that Rabbanim, Sephardish Rabbanim, went by the name Chacham. And so he was familiar to Sephardim, and it looked like they got the idea, you know what, he's in Altena, we'll ask him, and they sent him the letter, and this is the background for this tshuva that we started reading over here. Now before we go to the tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi, we need to ask ourselves, what indeed did David Nieto mean? What was he trying to say when he said those words, nature is God, and God is nature? So let's turn to the Shalah. The Shalah lived a little bit before this. The Shalah lived in the 1500s, early 1600s, and he speaks about two different ways of relating to the God's interaction with nature and with our world. Look what he says. The way people normally think about how the heavenly bodies work is as follows. Yes, God created everything out of nothing. And therefore, God can do whatever he wants. He could change the system. He can make miracles. However, in the beginning, God gave to the heavenly bodies koyach v'yacholes, the ability lahanig ha'olam, to direct the world. V'chol koichav mamuna almina shaloi, and every heavenly body is responsible for its own domain. And ha'olam kiminhagei noeg, the world operates in its way. Uchaviyachol, as if to say, zaza yadoi mehem, as if God removed his hand from the world. Rak, however, these people say, if God observes that he wants to change something, fine, then he'll intervene. He'll do a Yitzias Mitzrayim, he'll do a Kriyas Yamsuf. But that's breaking the system. The default is that he's disengaged. As long as he doesn't break the system, then the heavenly bodies, they direct what happens in our world, but due to the power vested in them at the time of creation. Again, Shalah is saying that this is called Svaras Ha'olam. The way I understand that to mean is many people, Jews and non-Jews, believe this way. What's he talking about here? So in previous classes we spoke about astrology, and this is a little bit related to that. The idea that heavenly bodies are responsible for different areas in life. There's one that's responsible for war, and another for blood, and another for healing, and another for beauty, and another for wisdom. And somehow each one of these is responsible for much more. Why? Because God gave them those abilities and those koiches. And so many people think that God walked away. He gave to these planets you go direct the world, and the Eibusher takes a nap. Now, they believe they're believing Jews, and perhaps non-Jews as well. So how do they reconcile their belief with this? They say that, if God wants to re-enter history, he always has the ability to do so, and that is a miracle. This is what the Shalah calls the Svaras Ha'olam. Amnam, he says, the truth is, Amitis ha'amunah nirabeinahi, if you want to know what I think is the truest amunah, it's interesting. He doesn't say that the previous view is kfira. He doesn't say it's heresy. And the reason he doesn't say it's heresy is because I think so long that the person is going to believe that the Eibusher has the ability to re-enter at any time that he wants, then it's not off the table to have this particular belief. But he still thinks it's wrong. And so he says the true amunah is that Hashem Yisbarach is mechadish b'tov v'choya and tamim ma'asav v'reishes. God renews creation every moment. B'chavana mechuvenes shoifei yashifoi, and his energy is emitted from him in a conscious way. And if God would withhold his energy even for one moment, everything would be as if it weren't. Batal hametzias, and all of metzias would become batal. If these words are familiar to you from the beginning of Shara Yichud V'Emunah, there's a reason for that, and that's because the Alter Rebbe was very much a student of the Shalah, and so used a number of his teachings and even some of his language. Now, but what's he saying here? He's saying here that that's not the emes is God is involved every minute in history. Then he deals with a question. The question he says in the Piyut Keil Adin that we say on Shabbos, we say Koyach u'Gvura nasam bohem liyos moshel mekerev teva, that God gave Koyach into the heavenly bodies that they should be moshlim bekerev teva. So he explains that's not what it means. It doesn't mean that God gave the full autonomy to these heavenly bodies and then he walked away. That's not what it means. What it means is that just like the eye has the ability has the tchunas, the physical eye has the tchunas to see, but according to Kabbalah, how does it work? There's a nefesh. You have a nefesh in the person, and the nefesh in the person, and through the eye being set up in a certain way, so then the nefesh is able to shine through it, and the person is able to see. Likewise with the ability to hear. The ear is set up in a certain way, that therefore when the nefesh is shining through that particular part of the body, it therefore turns out that the person is able to hear. So too, what it means that we say just means that God created each one of these heavenly bodies. Remember, he's within a very strong astrological model. So Eibusher created each one of these heavenly bodies that they have certain tchunas, that therefore it's able to do war, it's able to do blood, it's able to do beauty, it's able to do wisdom, it's able to do all these things. But on its own, it does nothing. And then when the Eibusher puts his energy through these heavenly bodies, so then it's able to affect what it's able to affect. This is the Shalah. The Alter Rebbe also addressed people who say God disengaged from the world, but you'll notice that when the Alter Rebbe talks about it, he does so differently. He refers to people who are koifrim ba'ashkacha pratis, people who deny miracles. In other words, this is a much stronger. This is creating a much stronger detachment between God and the world because it's absolute. This is a view that says it's absolute, that there cannot even be a miracle. And they go on. The Alter Rebbe goes on to say that these are people who compare Maaseh Hashem to Maaseh Enesh V'Tachbolosav. That just like when a human being makes a keli, the keli does not need the human being anymore. So Shamayim V'Aretz does not need the Eibusher anymore. Again, here the Alter Rebbe is saying that this is kfira because of the fact that gets in the way of nisim. Okay. So one is a 16th century, is written in the 1600s, early 1700s. Shar Yichud Ve'Amunah is written in the late 1700s. What do you have over here? We're dealing with something that's called theism. Theism is the view, or deism. Deism is the view that says that Azav Hashem Es Haaretz. The Eibishter is detached, he's no longer involved. There could be different madregas in deism, what type of detachment a person is doing, but this is a common thing. The fact that the Shalom was writing about it, the fact that the Alter Rebbe was writing about it, this was a common issue at the day. And many secular philosophers writing during this period of time subscribed to some sort of view that was similar to this. And this is where David Nieto's speech was coming. This is what he was trying to resolve. This is what he was trying to teach. And in fact, he's going. What? Which one was he coming? He was coming to negate this. David Nieto is coming to negate deism. So let's see how. So let's go back. Let's go back to the letter that the people from Amsterdam sent about the speech. Let's continue. So here is the speech that he gave on Chav Gimel Kislev. I said nature and God is one. God and nature is one, and now I'm going to defend it. And here he continues saying, again, we're reading from the letter that they sent to Amsterdam asking if this kosher. He says, King,
Was it in English?
No, sorry, this was written in Spanish, Portuguese, and it's been translated. King David confirms it in Kapitel Kuf Mem Zayin, where it says, sing to the Lord with thanksgiving, who covers the heavens with clouds, Hamachase Shamayim Ba'avin, Hamechin La'aretz Matar, Hamatzmiya Acharim Chatzer, who makes grass grow upon the mountain. Says Rabbi David Nieto in his speech, pay attention to this, you Jews, because it is the principal point to our religion. This is very, very important. What do you see clearly in this pasuk? Things that normally you say is nature. Rain, clouds, grass. That's nature, right? And what do we see? It's being directed by the Eibishter. So if you stop right here, what do you see he's trying to do? David Nieto is trying to do what the Shalom was doing. He's trying to do what the Alter Rebbe was doing. Don't say God is disengaged and maybe only re-intervenes if it's necessary for a miracle. No. The things that are everyday nature is Maaseh Hashem. He continues, but necessarily the word teva, nature, is the invention of our modern authors of about 400 to 500 years back, since it is not to be found in the literature of our ancient sages. He says, if you look at Chazal, at least you look at the Gemara and the Midrashim, you're not going to find them using the word teva. Why? Because there is no such a thing as teva. Because instead, what do the Chazal say? They say, who used to say, the blessed God causes the wind to blow. God causes the rain to descend. God sends the dew, from which we may infer that God does all that which the moderns ascribe to nature. So let's stop here. There are people, modern people, who in the early 1700s say, you know how this and this happened? Because of nature. A good word that's still used today that is this perspective is Mother Nature. Mother Nature, there's some sort of force that exists, and they just call it nature, and that force is kind of in charge for all the things that happen in this world. So he says, that's not Judaism, you can't believe that. It's all the Eibishter. Thus, it may be said, there is no nature, there's no such a thing. But that which is providence, hashgacha pratis, which people call teva, nature. And this is why I said that God and nature and God are all the same thing. That's what I meant. There is this force that people go around asserting that there's a certain force that kind of directs everything, and they call it nature, and they mean nature and not God. And they say that God created that force that, so to speak, is in control of everything, so therefore I come and say there's no such a thing. That thing is actually God. That thing you're actually supposed to worship as Eibush, as Mamish Elikus. This doctrine, so what I said is devout, it's pious, and it's holy, and those who do not subscribe to it, they are heretics and atheists. This ends the speech that he gave on Parshas Vayeshev, Chof Gimel Kislev, in the year 1703, November 20th, in the shul. Okay, so now you have to almost wonder, so what's the problem? Why is there even an issue over here? Okay, hold that thought for a second. They continue writing to the community in Amsterdam. And as the said pronouncement has been rejected by some and embraced by others, some people in the community are for it, some people are against it. In other words, the writers here are neutral. It is necessary that we should trouble your excellencies, praying that as zealous and God-fearing men, you should give orders to the gentlemen, chachamim, or the beistim of your noble congregation. In other words, they were writing to the balabatim in Amsterdam that they should tell the rabbanim in Amsterdam that they should expound for us the truth of our holy law on the point in question, so that we may, by their decision, know that which should be believed, and so obviate different opinions in such an important matter. How can we have a machlokes about this question? We can't have a machlokes about this question. We need an answer. And before they become deeply established, in the beginning, once people settle in on a belief, it's very, very hard to change it. And so therefore, we hope we get the answer. But, one second. We didn't get an answer. They didn't get an answer. And so therefore, they wrote to the Chacham Tzvi, as I said before. And so the Chacham Tzvi, in his tshuva, first what he does is he quotes a snatzlus from Rabbi David Nieto. In other words, Rabbi David Nieto wrote a memo to the Chacham Tzvi and says, by the way, and here's the speech that I said. And here I want to explain what I said. And when we read this, you'll better understand, because you're going to see he's apologizing. He's negating something. I didn't mean to say something, and this will make it clear what the problem was. So the Chacham Tzvi quotes this memo as follows. David Nieto says as follows. You know what? Before we read this, I'll summarize outside. You have the word nature could actually mean two different things. Before till now, when I was using the word nature, I was talking about in the sense of a controlling force in the universe, or Mother Nature. However, you could also refer to a nice scene as nature, or you could refer to the teva of a particular organism as nature, or that the nature of fire is hot, the nature of water is that it flows, right? So the word nature and the word teva can mean two different things. So now, if what you're saying is, on this Mother Nature, no such a thing exists, and whatever that is God, that's kosher, that's great, no problem. And that's what David Nieto was trying to say. If, however, a person would come and say, yeah, nature, as in the warmth of fire, that's God, that obviously is problematic. You can't talk about physical things in this world as being God. And so that's where the issue was. The word nature is itself an ambiguous word. So you had listeners in the shul said, you heard what he said? This cup is God. This cup is part of nature, right? This table is God. Oh, so he's a pantheist. So what's that? Pantheism was also in fashion then. Very much in fashion at that time. And that is to say, there is no God. And the only God is the world. Is the physical world, is God and nothing else. There is nothing other than the physical world. That's called pantheist. That all, pan means all in Greek, all is God. Everything is God. Now that could sound very holy, but everything is God only in the sense what we observe, what we experience in this physical world and nothing beyond it. There is no such a thing as a transcendent Eibishter. So in other words, you actually had two different philosophies that were pulling in different ways. One was very materialist. Materialist, sometimes it's associated with Spinoza, who lived at this time, which says, this is what you have, what you see is what you get, that's all there is. That was one prevailing philosophy. The other prevailing philosophy was of the deists, who believe in the existence of the God, but to various degrees detach him from the things from everyday life. So he gave a whole speech trying to negate the first view, trying to say, no, deism is wrong, the Eibishter is involved, God is nature. Now what he meant was that nature was that Mother Nature, the teva, that force that people say is kind of, there's like this software that kind of runs everything, and they were just saying it's called nature. He said, no, there's no nature, it's the Eibishter, it's God, that's providence. I never meant it on the specifics. So the words he uses to declare the difference between these two things is teva klali and teva prati. Teva klali is the word he uses more. And that you could say is God. That you could say, let's go worship it. Not we could worship, you have to worship it. We pray to that. So that's teva klali. And that's the one where he said, teva elikus is teva and teva is elikus. Then he goes on to say, teva prati, which what he means is an actual physical item with its unique characteristics, to point to that and to say that is God, that's off the table. So let's read a little inside to see how he makes this point. Davar Yodua, it is well known, Clouds and rain and plants, these are what he calls tivim pratim, detailed teva. But for us, we're going to call it's actual physical teva. It's also known the person who actually, the entity that actually covers the clouds with the sky with clouds. He is not one and the same with the cloud. In other words, if the pasuk says that God is the one who covers, who blankets the sky with clouds, so there's a clear distinction. There's the one who does the act, that's God, and then there's the actual cloud, which is the feature of nature. So he's like, I quoted that pasuk. If I quoted that pasuk, what does that mean? What does that mean? It means that very clearly I believe and I hold that there's a machasa. There's the entity that's doing it. And that's the God, not the cloud. If I really wanted to say that a cloud is God, that a table is God, then I wouldn't have had a source. I wouldn't have had psukim backing this up. I wouldn't have Chazal backing this up. Because the psukim talk about God blanketing the sky with clouds. It doesn't say that God is the cloud. And he goes on, we say Mashiv Haruach. That God is the actor behind the fact that there's ruach, behind the fact that there is wind, whereas he's not synonymous with the ruach. Memela nishma bebirur. So obviously, it's so clear if you read my words, shakavanasi lachriach, that I want to say shasiba hamachase shamayim, that the cause for why there is clouds, umafarachas ruchos, and why there's winds, amen or hateva. It's not this entity called teva, elet hakadosh baruch hu. But because there are people who consider this, they say, oh, Mother Nature, it's Mother Nature. So I'm showing them the truth. This that they attribute to Teva, you have to say, no, that same thing you're linking to Teva, you have to link to God. Which means I wasn't talking about teva in the sense of the teva of an organism or the nature of the nature in the sense of a beautiful scene or anything like that. This was his clarification that he was giving, and now we have a little bit more of an understanding of what the issue is. Now, if we're honest, and you look at the story, you're like, okay, this should have been clear. This should have been worked out. Like this should not have turned into this whole story that it turned into. So the Chacham Tzvi had a son who is very famous, who's known as the Yavis, Yaakov ben Tzvi, that's the Rosh Tevis. And he, uniquely from among Gedolei Yisrael, he wrote an autobiography, which is fascinating. How many Gedolei Yisrael wrote an autobiography about themselves, their own personal story? It's called Megillah Sefer. And in Megillah Sefer, he alludes to this incident, and he basically writes as follows. Ira Oz, the story then happened, Shadarash Chacham Nieto, Ha'av Bezin Shal Svardim Shabalondin Drush Al Inyan Teva. He gave that speech. Shahu, and he said that Teva is Hashem Yisbarach Ba'atzmai. Val Davar Zen is Eiru Olav Madonim, and now that turned into politics. Why? So he says, there was pre-existing politics and division in the community. And Anshe Atzada Echad, and one side, they hated him to the Chacham Rabbi David Nieto. The Orvim Limtzaloi Avain, and they ambushed him, looking to find a sin, Asharchata B'minus Chasasham, to accuse him of doing heresy, and that's why Asu Sharureha, and that's why they caused this whole tumult about this drasha. So did they find something that they could kind of reasonably get away with as an accusation? Yes, they did find something. Did they really honestly believe that that the rabbi was a pantheist, that he mamish believed that God is the physical things around him? Very, very difficult that this was the case. But you have to remember, a lot of the Jews are also not educated. They didn't have a very strong education, which is why there are many people who are probably on the fence and unsure, which is why they end up having this question going to Amsterdam and then eventually coming to London. Okay, so now let's get to the tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi. So what did he actually answer? So the Chacham Tzvi begins his tshuva by saying, the truth is, how does usually a tshuva from a Rav is halachic issues. There are some, but there are very few tshuvas that are like this, that deal with theological questions. But okay, he's going to do what he's used to. What's the Rav do the first thing? You try to find precedent. So he's going to try to find precedent, and he wants to find, is there another Gadol B'Yisrael that said words that were similar to what David Nieto said. And he says, yes, he says, in fact, there is a commentary to the Kuzri, the original Kuzri, that was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. There's a comment to that Kuzri, a commentary called Kol Yehuda, written by a man named Yehuda Moscato, Italy, 1530 to 1589. Those are his dates. And he wrote a prominent pirush to Kol Yehuda. And look what he writes. We call God Teva. Why? Because he's Toveya b'chaysamai kol matbeyos hayetzurim. Because he engraves with his seal the shape and the look of every single creature. In Hebrew, how do you say a coin? Matbeya. Why is a coin called a matbeya? Because matbeya has a certain shape, has a certain form, has a certain image, and that's the word teva. So God engraves or places or configures each individual entity in a certain way, and this is why he's called Tava. And Rabbi Yehuda Moscato goes on to say, links this to the idea of Hashgacha Pratis, that Hashem is involved in every single one of the creatures, from the biggest ones to the smallest ones. So, look, now he wasn't saying the mamish, the same point that David Nieto was saying, but generally speaking, we see he was comfortable using the word Teva. He was comfortable using the word Teva for Hashem, and he gives a specific reason. He doesn't here mean nature. He doesn't mean nature so much. But at the end of the day, he was comfortable using the word teva for the individual characteristics of each thing. And because God is the one who gives that, therefore the Eibusher himself is teva. No, so that's a little bit of a source. So we can calm down. That's number one. Then we come to the main part of the tshuva, the Chacham Tzvi, where he writes the main issues. So let's read that at number 12. Vani shamati. I listen to the complaints. I don't understand what's bothering the people. Is it because he's denying the concept of this mother nature? They're so enamored with this idea that there should be this general nature. Why? Because they think that it's degrading for God. People think, what? The great God is going to be involved in us? Better say that he set up a software system that runs the show and he gets involved when he needs to. So maybe that's what's bothering them. This is just what the Chacham Tzvi is trying to figure out. Yedu, you should know, if you're looking for nature to run its own thing, you're going to cause many different problems. If you believe in Hashgacha of Hashem b'chol davar, ki b'chol asher yifnu yelchu betach, then wherever you will turn, you will be confident. In other words, you can have much stronger betachin. It seems like he's making an emotional argument. Again, it seems from the Shalah that if you believe God could re-enter whenever he wants, and that he does re-enter whenever he wants, that it doesn't seem to cross the line into kfira. So what argument to go against it? He says if you want to have that type of viewpoint is not good for betachin pashut, that a person should feel confident in his day-to-day affairs. How could you feel confident in your day-to-day affairs if you say that he runs he lets the software program runs and he turns away? Okay, so that can't be the issue. They think that David Nieto meant that tables and chairs are God? That the warmth of fire and the wetness of water, is that what they wanted to say? You can't even assume that someone without brains would say something like that. It's very clear what he meant. That he's talking about he's talking about mother nature. That's what he means with God. He's talking about that general concept of nature. He's not talking about nature as in physical items. So that can't be an issue either. Oh, maybe it's just a wording issue. Maybe it was a wording issue. And that is, they agree in concept that this idea that there's this force that's called nature, no, that force is really God. They agree with that. But they just are not happy with David Nieto saying that we could almost use nature as a God's name. Maybe the issue is partial with the naming. He says, can't be. Why can't it be? Because I'm going to bring you from G'dayli Yisrael who used the word Teva and linked it to God. So the truth is he already had Rabbi Yehuda Moscato who did that. But now he's going to bring even more prominent sources. So he brings here from the Shalom. And the Shalah has a very interesting conversation that he quotes from other Mekubalim, namely from Menachem Rekanti, who was one of the Rishonim who lived in Italy. And they have a very interesting discussion about schar va'oinish, right? What's the primitive way of thinking about schar va'oinish? I think it's relatively speaking primitive, is that you made the Eibishter mad, so to speak. Because you made the Eibishter mad, so therefore he's going to come out and he's going to lash out against you. Or you made the Eibishter happy, so because you're happy, so therefore he brings you. That's one way of looking at it. The Shalah said that he thinks that's primitive. So he writes, Ein haschar v'ha'oinish haskemi rak hu tivi. It's not, haskemi is actually a hard word to translate in English, so the concept is, it's TV, it's natural. What does he mean by that? So he quotes the Rekanti in Parshas Bechukosai that says as follows, Da, ki abracha is va'klala is haksuv is b'toira. Einam al tzad ha'gmul va'inish levad. It's not reward and punishment alone. Raking tivya is mamish, kedinyan hazareah shekaiser. Just like when you plant, you reap. If you don't wear clothes, you're going to be cold. So too, Hashem created the world in such a way that when a person engages in mitzvahs, so then as a natural result of that, he gets the brachas. And when a person does negative things, it's like when a person sticks their hands into the fire. It's not that God watched and he saw that you stick your hand into the fire. So he said, now I'm upset at you. And so therefore I'm going to burn your hand. That's not how it works. It's that the automatic result of sticking your hand in fire, because God made it that way, is that it burnt. And so he is saying that the Shalah is saying, the Rekanti is saying that this is how schar v'oinish works. Obviously, it's a whole topic in itself, schar v'oinish, which doesn't need to concern us now. But look at the words that they used. The words that they both used, Shalah, was teva. They're talking about God's system of reward and punishment, and they called it teva. Both the Rekanti and the Shalah. That's one example that the Chacham Tzvi brings. Then he turns to the Emek HaMelech. The Emek HaMelech is a Kabbalah sefer that's it's written under the inspiration of the Arizal, and there's a famous passage there toward the beginning of the sefer, or toward the beginning of one section of the sefer. It says as follows: Koydem kol davar, before anything, Allah b'rtzayne apashat livrei ha'olamis. God wanted. This is authored in the 1600s in Germany. God wanted to create the world. Why? Because he can't be a king without having a people. That's why God wanted the world. Vigam, another reason why he wanted the world, teva hatoiv lehetiv. Because the nature of good, God is good. The nature of good is to bestow goodness. V'im she'ein olam, if you don't have a world, lemiyetiv, how are you going to bestow goodness? What do you see here from the Emek HaMelech? He used for the Eibishter, teva hatoiv lehetiv, that used the word teva. So that can't be the problem. So again, if the issue was, you can't have God without an intermediary, because then it means he's involved in puny matters. No, we reject that. That's not okay. If you think that David Nieto was saying tables and chairs are God, no way he meant that, and that's really clear. If it's a naming issue, we see there isn't a naming issue with it. There's nothing wrong with referring to aspects of God as nature. And so therefore, he says, but he concludes the tshuva saying, we need to be grateful to this great rabbi of David Nieto, to warn the people and encourage the people that they should not follow the philosophers, meaning the deists. And he showed them the true faith, that everything is with God's providence. And although really this tshuva is rather obvious, and so therefore I could have signed this myself, I went to two of the great scholars here in Altena, and we discussed the matter, and we agreed that this is emes or tzedek, and he writes, Poi Altena, that's where he lived, Yom Vav, Friday of Yud Zayin Menachem of Shnas Tov Samachei, that's the summer. Oh, he actually just writes Menachem. This was common, by the way. So you not write Menachem of, just write Menachem. Shnas Tov Samachei, that's 1705. It was about a month after. This tshuva was written about a month after that Rabbi Yosef passed away while still in excommunication, and which is why he was buried on the margins of the cemetery. The issue hadn't been resolved yet. Now it was resolved by the time they sent this back. And all the sources seem to indicate that once this happened, that the story was over. And he signs his name, Tzvi Ashkenazi Samach Tes. So just a word on this. Sephardim have this custom. Many Sephardim have this custom of signing their names Tamachtes, and it's often assumed that this means Sephardi Tahor. The problem is that Tzvi Ashkenazi was not a Sephardi Tahor. At least for him, he probably did not mean Sephardi Tahor. It could be other people meant that, whether today or maybe even then, I don't know. But it's hard to believe that he meant that. And so the other alternative reading for this is Seifei Tav, may his end be good, which is another way of saying may he have a good life, may he have a long life and die after Mea ve'esrim shana. So it's basically saying Shlita. That's probably what he meant, again, about others, ichvesish. Okay, so that summarizes this issue. And again, the sources seem to indicate that that after this, the fight kind of subsided, and Rabbi David Nieto went on to write his sefer that we spoke about earlier, and he published it, and it's a chashva sefer, it's a prominent book, and that's that. Now, this whole tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi actually surfaces a few times in Chabad Chassidus. How is that? So first of all, Chabad Chassidus, quoting from earlier sources, from Mekubalim, talk about how the different names of Hashem, each one has its own significance. And the name of Elikim is Gematria Tava. This was already said by earlier. It's not, obviously not Elikim with a kuf. It's Elikim Aleph Lamed Hey Yud Mem. It's Begematria Ha Teva. Okay, so this was said already by like the Pardes. The Rav Moshe Cordovero, writing in the 1500s, he pointed out that there is this link. What is the meaning of this link? Obviously, there's a special link between Shem Elikim, this aspect of God, more so than any other, with Teva. What is the connection between the two? So Chassidus explains, here's one example in the Likutei Torah. There are many other examples where Chassidus says along these lines, Elikim is Gematria HaTeva. Why? Because Shem Elikim is the Mogen and the Nartik HaMaster Al Gilui Shem Havaya. Shem Havaya represents God where he's revealed. And anyone who comes into contact with Shem Havaya automatically witnesses Hashem. And so, in other words, we're dealing here with a problem. If we're right that the Eibusher is really in control of everything, so, and that's, why don't we observe that? This is like the big question that a lot of the Mekubalim discuss. Well, the answer to that is that as much as all of this is God's doing, but there's this Shem Elokim, there's this concept of Helen Vehester, of concealment, which doesn't allow us to see the truth. And because of that, it appears to us that the world is operating on its own. And that's called Teva. So now we know, why is Elikim Bigematria Teva? Elikim is what allows the facade of, I don't see him. And it allows that reality to set in. And so what do we see? We see nature. Afshu be'emes hakoil, everything is Mishem Havaya, who's Mechadish B'tuv B'choy and Tom Ma'aseh Bereishis. And so, but we don't see that because Shenimshach Hadei Mogen V'nartek HaMachasa O'Master. This is the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and he adds, or maybe it's the Tzemach Tzedek who adds, I'm not sure, V'ayin Me'inyan HaTeva, Shailas HaTshuvas, Chacham Tzvi, Simen Yud Ches, and it's Korov L'Masha Omarnu. It's similar. It's not exactly to what we're talking about here, but it's similar to what we're talking about. Okay, I mean, it's a little different. The tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi is just saying that there is this force, there's this Mother Nature kind of force that's directing everything, that people believe in. So we come and say, by the way, it's not Mother Nature, it's really God. So I say, Tava Zalikus. That's an akuda in the tshuva of Chacham Tzvi. Here, the nakuda over here is, really, if the Eibusher is creating everything, it should be so obvious and apparent. Why don't we see it? That's because God has this concealing power within himself, represented by Shem Elikim, which doesn't allow us to see this truth, which therefore, the result is that we see Teva, that we see nature. So it's kind of, they don't really see, these sources don't really seem to be in conversation with each other. Okay, this is brought in many different places in Chassidus. It's when it says Elikim and it links it to Teva, it refers to this tshuva. All right. But really, there's a more important conversation to have over here. The more important conversation to have is that there's a statement in Chassidus that summarizes many, many, many teachings of Chassidus that is awfully similar to what David Nieto said. And that is, David Nieto said, God is nature and nature is God. Okay? He explained what he meant. He didn't mean this. He didn't mean me. He didn't mean my body and your. He didn't mean any of this. He meant that up there in the Reki Hashvi. That nature is God. Right? Okay. Chassidus has a very similar line that does mean down here. The Sikha the Frierdiker Rebbe that sums this up where he says, in kurzer Wörter heißt das, is alt is He is everything, and everything is him. Very, very similar words to the words of David Nieto. But what does this mean? Alt here means everything in existence, every single level, spiritual, physical, every single thing in reality is part of the Eibishter, said in two ways. One, is alt, and the other, he is everything, and the other, alt is Okay. So in other words, what they worked really hard, both Rabbi David Nieto and the Chacham Tzvi, to say is off the table. That wasn't part of the discussion. Well, the reality is that the Mekubalim and then Hasidus very much put it onto the table. They said, what do you mean? No one ever thought about calling Elikus to anything that's a physical thing. No, it's just to the element of nature that directs everything. That could be called Elikus. Okay? But Chassidus has this idea, is alt, and alt is and this is obviously a huge topic. And it turns out that a big controversy erupted because of this. So we have a letter from the Alter Rebbe in Tov Kuf Nun Zayin. This is 1797. And basically the historical context of this letter is there's this dispute between Hasidim and the non-Hasidim. We have to put an end to this dispute, and let's kind of set up some sort of meeting, and we'll get Rabbanim and mediators like the Chacham Tzvi style issue, and we're going to resolve our dispute. The Alter Rebbe wrote that he does not believe that it's going to be really possible to resolve the dispute for numerous reasons. And while so doing, he talks about the theological protests that the Gra and others had against Hasidim. So let's read the text. According to what I heard from his Talmidim, it's going to be clear. It's clear from the context it's referring to the Gra. This is his argument, I'll say, for Likutei Amarim, on the book Likutei Amarim. This is not the Tanya. Likutei Amarim here means the teachings of the Maggid of Mizrich, which were already printed. Asher Mefurish Bem, where it says in these Svarim, Pirush Mamale Kalamim, when it says God fills up all of the worlds, which is a language in the Zohar, and the Zohar also says, Leis Hasar Panim Minei, there is no place void of him. So the Hasidic Svarim take this literally, Kipshutai Mamish. However, in his eyes, he apikursis gemura. It's heresy, lemar, to say to say that God is in lowly items. How can you say such a thing? So how do they interpret the word God fills everything? It just means providence, which is exactly what David Nieto is saying. The focus is the providence. That's God, but nothing else. Nothing else. We can't look at anything else and say that that it's part of God or anything like that. This language made them very nervous, and the Alter Rebbe is saying that this is the difference: how you interpret the words Leis Hasar Panim Minei and how you interpret the words Mamale Kalam, and he fills up all of the worlds. Then one second. Then it goes further. He says that there's also the issue of the sparks from the klippas, and he talks about what is a spark from the klippas. That means there's a part of God, so to speak, that's in negativity. So he says, look, the Alter Rebbe says, you're not going to find this idea before the Arizal. It doesn't exist. Even in the Zohar, it's not there befedish. Okay, so really, the only way to accept this idea is trusting in the Arizal. So he says, I believe that every word from the Arizal was taught them by Eliyahu and to the Hanavi, this spiritual revelation, and therefore I accept everything. However, my understanding is that the Gra does not accept that everything from the Gra is from Eliyahu, only a little, and the rest Arizal developed with his own mind, and therefore the Gra feels comfortable saying, this I accept and this I reject. So in other words, we see the Gra had two issues. One issue was, how can you say that means God is present here in the physical world? You can't say that. And number two, how can you say that there's a spark of God in Klippa? You can't say that. And the Alter Rebbe brings us up to say, how are we going to resolve this type of issue? The Alter Rebbe felt there was no real way at that time, especially because he had tried earlier. He didn't feel there was anything to do that would actually change this. Okay, so this really opens a whole other topic, so we need to understand. So why is this okay? Why is what Chassidus say is okay? So obviously, just state the obvious. Chassidus is never saying that God is limited to a particular table. Chassidus is saying that God is God who transcends everything. And he also is present within a particular item, number one. Number two, there's never a conversation in Kabbalistic or Hasidic sources about, therefore, worshiping the table. That's not on the table. Why? Because that's not what the table is. The table is what you observe. That's what and that's your experience. And so, therefore, to talk about you observe, you having a conversation of treating it as a God is never on the table. But yes, Hasidus does speak about something that was off the table for the Chacham Tzvi, that was off the table for David Nieto, and that is the idea that God is present in everything, using very similar language to David Nieto. So it kind of would have been interesting if Reb David Nieto and the Chacham Tzvi, would have been able to see what happened just about 100 years later and to observe this whole conversation. That probably would have been interesting. Okay, let's close this out about Hanukkah, and then we'll take comments and questions. Hanukkah is coming, and so all of this we can connect to the Yom Tov of Hanukkah. Why? It's a very well-known question that everyone likes to talk about all the time, about why is the miracle of Hanukkah 8 days? The miracle is only 7, because they found enough oil to last for 1 day. There are hundreds and hundreds of answers, or at least they say there are hundreds of answers to this question. Interestingly, the Rishonim didn't seem too bothered by this question because none of them really addressed it for whatever reason. But in the last 500 years, there's been so many answers that have been poured on to this. So I saw in the Sefer, I think it was called Yismach Yisrael, from the Rebbe, from the Alexander Rebbe, I don't remember right now. But anyway, it's a beautiful vart. He says, and this connects a little to what we're talking about. He says that in the Mois Sur, there's a line there where it says, B'nei Vina Yemei Shmoina. Mois Sur is not the easiest piyut to read and to understand. But B'nei Vina, they're understanders, children of understanding, Yemei Shmoina Kavu, and then they made the Yom Tov for 8. So in other words, there was a certain type of understanding that allowed them to make the Yom Tov of Hanukkah for 8 days. Why? He says, because the intuition is the teva you take for granted. That I got, I have that in the bag. And so we become, we take it as a given and we become not so grateful about it. The miracle, we do the miracle. So they were B'nai Vina, they had a Bina, they were to understand that what? Only for the 7 miraculous nights I'm going to thank God, but for the fact that He did the miracle of creating the world with the oil in the first place and giving us the ability to have light from that. So because it's nature, so therefore you're not going to thank Him. That also deserves deserves thanks. Why? Because that teva is also Eibishter. That was exactly what David Nieto's point was. That teva is bashgacha from Hashem. It's not a separate thing. So therefore, I don't know, maybe even the discussion happened 2 days before Hanukkah, Chav Gimel Kislev, maybe they were talking about miracles at the time. Maybe they're talking about the miracle of Hanukkah, maybe that's why it came up. I don't know, that's speculation. But anyway, this is a small window into a very interesting saga that took place in London at the cradle of this Jewish community at the time. All right,